return of blood to the centre, there's an increased pressure in the pulmonary system, and if the athlete is hyperhydrated or indeed has an underlying condition such as hypertension, it may cause death. Shallow water blackout is another concern for sudden cardiac death among swimming. I won't go into detail here, I don't have really too much time, so I'll move on. Exertional heat stroke and immersion hypothermia is something that was talked about yesterday, and we all know cases here within the room of sudden cardiac death among this, for this reason. As we move on, ion channelopathies are another important cause of sudden cardiac death among swimming. Among the general population of athletes, it's relatively quite rare, but we must understand that the prevalence of sudden unexplained death in certain cohorts is high. And there has been data to suggest, indeed among swimming, that among unexplained drowning victims, that indeed about 30% of these have been attributed actually to ion channelopathies. So it's something just to be considered here. Long QT is a really important one for us in the swimming fraternity, because 1/3 of events of the most prevalent type of long QT occur during swimming. And this is something to really take note of. Cardiomyopathies is the kind of condition which is attributed and has been heavily researched in terms of sudden cardiac death among athletes. And hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is typically the main culprit of however, among general athlete populations, we see once again the prevalence significantly varies. So in the US registry, 35% of sudden cardiac death cases were among hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in comparison to just 1% in Italy. Initially, we thought this may be due to a genetic variant. However, we also see in the NCAA, also in America, the prevalence of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is quite low. So ultimately, the thinking now is that their implementation of cardiac prevention, sudden cardiac death prevention, may be the reason for this discrepancy in prevalence. I've kind of answered my own question here, but how can we recognise those predisposed to sudden cardiac death? Well, the answer is cardiovascular screening. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into a secondary prevention, which is implementation of AEDs, but again, it's incredibly important and something that should not be ignored. Nevertheless, cardiovascular screening has been widely adopted throughout the world, and indeed it is the viewpoint of the two major cardiology bodies that cardiovascular screening is advocated both on medical, legal, and ethical grounds. And importantly, all in all, because sudden cardiac death among athletes is often silent, and indeed up to 80% do not have had no previous prior symptoms or family history of sudden cardiac death, which almost kind of makes my next slide slightly controversial again, because the methodology of cardiac screening is still debated, and the debate revolves around the implementation of an ECG. Antagonists for ECG screening cite the fact that it is not cost effective, there's a high false positive rate, and indeed there's a lack of qualified personnel to be able to interpret the data. However, advanced When we look at ECG, the sensitivity is increased up to 100% in some cohorts. And this is really because of the ability to identify the cardiomyopathies, in particular hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is identifiable upon 95% of ECGs. In addition, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, another variant, is identifiable in 80% of ECGs. Nevertheless, we must also take into account the specificity. So this is really the ability of the test to identify those who don't have pathology and who have a normal screening. And here you see, while the history and physical exam again perform quite poorly, this is identified particularly well among a colleague of mine, Matt Wilson. He did a study way back when and identified that among those in the history and physical exam, 33% had an abnormal finding. Now this was when the athlete themselves had to fill out the questionnaire. When they sat down with the cardiologist, this was reduced to just 1.9%. So it really stresses the importance of sports cardiology expertise within sports medicine and cardiology. And the interaction between the two is really, really important. It's also quite weird that in America, the screening is also, chiropractors and nurses are also able to undertake the screening. And that is again worrying given the expertise that is needed here. Nevertheless, when we look at the specificity of ECG, we also acknowledge the fact that it is quite low. And it's important for us within swimming because the remodelling of the heart is vastly different to that than what we see in the general cohort of athletes. And here we would see typically in an athlete physiological derived increased wall thickness, increased internal diameter, maybe increased in atrial enlargement and hypertrabeculation as well. And all of this may mimic some cardiomyopathies. And so it's difficult for a sports medicine physician and cardiologist alike to sometimes differentiate between the physiological and pathological remodeling of the heart. And this has really driven the drive for ECG interpretation criteria in athletes, because we know that they remodel differently, both structurally, like I showed, and upon the ECG. Here you can see some variants on the ECG, which would otherwise be considered abnormal, but in the athlete, wholly normal. As time has gone on, the interpretation criteria has developed, and we're now at a point where we really think the false positives are really quite at an acceptable level. This was some of our data from Qatar, and so by looking at the false positive rate of using the ESC criteria, it was as high as 22%. And this is worrying because it means that 22% are undergoing investigations that are unnecessary and could place the athlete at distress and maybe make them detrain and things like that, which they're not cool. As we've gone on and used different criteria, we've got down to a false positive rate of just 5% using the latest modern criteria. And again, we feel that this is in the realm of acceptability. We're not stopping there though. Last year, a group of us convened in Seattle to devise some new ECG interpretation criteria. And these international recommendations will hopefully be published soon. I was fortunate enough to be part of this, and we really focused on the ability of the sports medicine physician to be able to identify the abnormal ECG, and also really guide the sports medicine physician in what to expect and what further investigations may be needed here. So that will be published soon, and I'm really looking forward to that coming out. Again, hopefully it will decrease the false positive rate when this is implemented. Nevertheless, these ECG interpretation criteria, they account for age, sex and ethnicity. However, they don't account for the type of sport. And we see here that swimming really does have a significant cardiac remodeling and figures quite highly in terms of the different sports. We see an increased wall thickness and an increased internal diameter. And it remodels significantly different to that of most other sports we see. And so how does this really impact upon us in the cardiac screening environment? We've got to go deeper really, because ultimately the swimming environment is uniquely different. So the hydrostatic pressure that we see displaces the amount of blood from the periphery to the center. And ultimately, this serves to increase preload. And the horizontal position of the athlete and the kicking of the legs also increases the amount of blood returning to the heart. And this increases what we call preload, which is the stretch of the heart, and it increases stroke volume and cardiac output. Interestingly, however, though, a thing called afterload, which is the pressure the heart must pump against, is not elevated in comparison to other sports. And this is strange, but it's because of a decrease in total peripheral resistance. And this is again linked to heart rate. And we know that the heart rate among elite swimmers, when they're performing at maximum levels, is decreased in comparison to other sports. Nevertheless, the heart still must maintain its pumping ability to maintain cardiac output and blood pressure. And so we think that swimmers must have an increased stroke volume in comparison to other sports. And so once again, reiterating the fact that we think the swimmer's heart is vastly different to that of other athletes. Unfortunately, when we're looking at the implications on ECG screening, the data among swimmers is just simply not there. Among endurance athletes, however, we know that they have an increased prevalence of normal and abnormal findings. With the development of the ECG interpretation criteria, this prevalence does reduce. However, we still see abnormal ECG findings, and these are T-wave inversions, which are still considered vastly abnormal, certainly among Caucasian athletes. Nevertheless, we think that this high prevalence of T-wave inversions in the anterior leads among elite endurance athletes and swimmers probably alike is due to an increased right ventricular load. Other data from the UK has shown, again, particularly relevant to us here today, that the intensity of the sport, which of course swimming is, it's a high intensity sport, but also the level of competition at which the athlete competes, affects the prevalence of abnormal ECGs. And so for us in the swimming community, we do predict that they will have an increased prevalence of abnormal ECGs. But ultimately, how does this affect us in ECG? Well, we don't know whether this will affect the ECG interpretation. So ultimately, we wanted to really look into this in detail. So in 2014, we conducted a pilot study. FINA drove the study with the help of ASPETAR because it was in Doha and Qatar. And we wanted to establish the prevalence of abnormal findings because, again, we thought that this would be increased in comparison to other athletes. We also wanted to ascertain the feasibility of in-competition cardiac screening, something that has not been done outside of football. So we saw 127 athletes who came in for screening, 80 of which were invited because we wanted to reduce the bias. Importantly, among these, 48% had never been screened before, and which is quite stark, really, considering these were world-class athletes. And indeed, these were from all around the world. Many countries were represented in this cohort. And this is important because there are countries in some developing nations which don't have access to the medical provisions. And it was really the drive of FINA who wanted to provide this open access to cardiac screening to aid the health of the athlete. We only screen the athletes after competition, which kind of skewed the data towards the end. This will be changing this year. Nevertheless, this is what we found. So ultimately, these were incredibly highly trained individuals. And talking about what I said before about the prevalence of personal symptoms, this is really quite remarkably high. So 33% reported personal symptoms such as chest pain or palpitations or something like that. Nevertheless, with our sports cardiology expertise, we had Dr. Maria Carmen Adamus and Antonio Palicia, who are really world experts in cardiology, in sports cardiology. And so this prevalence of personal symptoms was reduced, and actually only a handful were investigated further. The prevalence of training-related ECG findings was again, as we expected, really quite high, as much as 98% in the males. The prevalence of abnormal findings, however, was quite high, and we didn't really expect to find this. However, taking in the previous research of endurance athletes, it kind of makes sense. So the right ventricle hypertrophy and the right atrial enlargement were the key drivers of changes on the ECG. When we look at the actual criteria, so we identified that 15% had an abnormal finding, and again, like I said, we thought that was quite high. When we use the new refined criteria, however, this reduced to, once again, an acceptable 3.8% of finding of athletes. There was no serious cardiac pathology identified. We did find one athlete with a bicuspid aortic valve, and he is now under the further annual follow-up with our cardiologist in ASPETAR. Of course, there were challenges to this. I'll start with the benefits of what we found, and again, talking about the access to cardiac screening in athletes and nations which were otherwise unavailable. And also, it allowed us to just provide education for the teams and really drive knowledge sharing, really. The challenges were really driven by the logistical problems and also the finances. Fortunately, FINA have really been instrumental in this, and with the help of ASPETAR, we found that in-competition screening was actually a feasible practice. And ultimately, we will be continuing this year. So we will be screening all athletes over the age of 18, available throughout the whole championships, and we will be doing it using the questionnaire, physical exam, and ECG. And echocardiography will be available on site. And although some of you are maybe against cardiac screening, or indeed your athletes have already been screened back home, hopefully what I've shown you earlier convinces you to kind of just engage with us, because we really want to find the prevalence of these abnormal findings and really drive to understand whether the swimmer's heart is different to that of other sports, and ultimately whether we can shape further international ECG interpretation criteria in the future. So thank you very much. Are questions now or later? Or no questions? Okay, yeah. So if anybody has any questions.
Swimming used pulmonary edema. Do you see more in triathletes, and wearing wetsuits, does it have influence?
And the preload swimming with wetsuits.
I've not found any data looking at that actually. No, I've not found any, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Another question on the pulmonary edema. What would you suggest for people who have triathletes with hypertension, anticipatory guidance, any advice? As more and more are doing it as a recreational activity.
Yeah, so ultimately there's only a few case studies looking at emergent-induced pulmonary edema. And ultimately, I'm not a cardiologist, so I really can't offer the advice. I'm just a poor little physiologist. So I don't really have, I don't feel like I'm capable of offering that kind of advice. We do know, like you said, it's more prevalent in those with hypertension. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't offer you any advice there. But I can put you in touch with other people if you want.
Great. We're just tight for time because we have 5 presenters, so if there are questions at the end, we're more than welcome to take them.